develop its activity. Thank you very much. Without further ado, last but not least, I will give the floor to another lady. It's my pleasure to welcome ladies, Mrs. Hanna Saarinen, who will be talking about investing in inclusive agricultural trade that benefits farmers, because that's a main issue, as was already mentioned. We think that the EU cap and subsidized agriculture is detrimental to African farmers, and there were certain cases that led to riots where farmers thought that their products were not purchased locally because of the imported products, because the imported products are often cheaper because they're subsidized, and so they become cheaper than the local products, and this weakens the situation of African agricultural farmers. And within the ACFTA will try to find solutions to that issue. So Mrs. Hanna Saarinen is the policy advisor of food for agriculture, which is called Oxfam, and I'm very happy for you to join us and to talk about inclusive agricultural trade that will benefit farmers. You have the floor. Thank you, Excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now speak English.
So, in order to save time, I could just resume my presentation saying, let's make smallholders great again. But please bear with me for a couple of slides. I will speak of inclusivity in value chains. And my presentation sort of takes off with the recognition that the smallholders are the most important investors and private sector actors in agriculture. So they produce an estimated 70% of the world's food supply. By some estimates, it's even 80%. They have a key role in rural poverty reduction. And they also have a role in protecting and the environment and the reproduction of biodiversity. Smallholders hold an enormous potential. But at the same time, they do not receive the adequate recognition or support that they would deserve. So support both in terms of financial support as well as policy support. For example, we are quite painfully aware of the unmet Malabo commitments. ODA, official development aid from donors, has been on the decline since the 80s to this sector. Public policy often is biased towards large-scale agriculture. Also, smallholders often, they do not receive fair prices for the goods that they produce, and the incomes are far from being sufficient. I will speak of the so-called living income concept a little bit more in detail. Living income, it refers to a decent standard of living, so incomes sufficient to sustain such standard of living. Also, for smallholders, the market opportunities are curtailed, and they do face systematic marginalization in accessing fair markets. There is also quite an important imbalance between the risks that they shoulder in agriculture and then the opportunities and the power to shape their own market participation. So there's been a declining bargaining power for smallholders from the 1980s up until early 2000s. We've been observing the promotion of neoliberal ideology in trade and agriculture. So this has meant that many governments and donors, they pursue trade liberalisation. There is quite an important deregulation of agriculture and labour markets. There is insufficient public support to agriculture. And all this has led to decreasing domestic support programs, for example, leading to reduced income or price support for small-scale holders, for example, in the form of dismantling market boards and overhauling price floors. Also, the export subsidies have been cut, and markets have been opened for food imports. So I have economics background myself. I believe in the virtues of trade liberalization up to a certain point. But we do need to recognize that when investment or agricultural liberalization is ill-designed, it comes with a lot of problems, and it is the smallholders who often would bear the highest price of that. One recent case that came to my mind when I was preparing the exposé, it was precisely the case of Western African dairy farmers and the imports of cheap milk powder from European Union, which actually does harm the local livelihoods, the local dairy farmers, producers, opportunities quite radically. So basically the local producers are fighting and trying to struggle against milk powder products, which have been subsidized in Europe. Basically the European Union is trying to export the surplus in cheese, milk powder to international markets. And in West Africa, there are milk powder products which cost 30% less than local products. So it's impossible for the local producers to have an equal footing in this kind of setup. Importantly, I would like to highlight that it is the women smallholders who often suffer the most or who are the most marginalized. So they do face particularly high exposure to risks and to lack of opportunities. And this does then further reduce their access and control over means of production and market opportunities. Let's dive a little bit further into farmer incomes in food supply chains. So at Oxfam, we commissioned 12 case studies recently. 6 of those case studies were specifically on smallholder producers, farmers, and 6 of them looked into agricultural workers. I have only here included the products and the countries relevant for farmers. So it includes cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, banana in Ecuador, coffee in Colombia, orange juice in Brazil, rice in Thailand, and green beans in Kenya. And what we found out when looking into the incomes that farmers get in these value chains, the right-hand column, it states the average income as percentage of living income. So living income, it's the minimum level of income that is needed for basic needs, for housing, for food, some other necessities. And it turns out that all of the value chains, all the farmers that we analyzed, so the 12 value chains, in all of them, the agricultural producers and workers earned less than a living income. In the case of cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, they reached 81%, which was the highest. It's still 1/5 less than what is needed for living income. In terms of the green beans production in Kenya, the farmers only earned 53%. So it does mean that the farmers, through their work, they are not able to sustain themselves. Diving a little bit more in detail into the green beans value chain. So in fact, the Kenyan producers, they are market leaders in exports to the European Union. And between 2000 and 2015, consumer prices in this product, they were increased threefold. Between 1997 and 2015, the export prices, they went down by 50%. And between 1997 and 2015, the prices paid for the farmers, they dropped by 1/3. So there is quite a stark contrast between what the consumers are paying in Europe, which has tripled, and then what the farmers are getting, which is going down by 1/3. And actually the overall share of the green bean farmer in Kenya, of the consumer, the end consumer price in Europe, it's only 2.2%. So out of the price that consumers in European Union pay, out of that price, only 2.2% goes to the farmer. So what shall be done? How do we raise smallholder incomes? We actually believe that the income issue, it's really one of the biggest bottlenecks in agriculture. That is one of the main reasons what keeps youth out of agriculture. If there are no decent opportunities to earn a sufficient income to sustain you and your family, it's not an attractive sector for any youth to engage in. So I mentioned earlier this imbalance between the risks that the farmers bear and then the bargaining opportunities and their opportunities to engage in markets, in fair markets. So there is currently this imbalance, and there would need to be measures to balance it out. So address the risks and then increase the bargaining power. So in this slide, there are selected key risks and opportunities that we selected. So among the most important risks, they are related to price volatility and unpredictability. It's actually quite hard for farmers or farmer organizations to tackle this because especially in international markets, the commodity prices are a little bit outside of the control of producers. But there can be safety nets to help to tackle the risk. Another set of risk relates to production input costs, their availability and their sustainability. And when farmers do move towards more industrial agriculture, they also become more dependent on external production inputs. This actually increases their risk. So there may be other agricultural models that actually expose farmers less to this kind of external risks. I'm mentioning, for example, agroecology as one potential model, or others who are less dependent on external inputs. Climate risks, they are an increasingly important issue to take into account. The adaptive capability of farmers is not often supported enough. And then lastly, the risks related to land. So this can mean insecure land tenure, but also risks related to the quality of land or the localization of land. Then on the more positive side of the balance, so increasing market power for farmers. So access, well, it is determined quite far by the availability of infrastructure, services, market information, and also the skills and capacities of farmers. Sometimes going local can be more attractive than engaging in long international value chains. Bargaining power can be increased by collective actions. So farmer organizations, cooperatives, they are hugely important in increasing farmer opportunities. And this is not only in terms of negotiating prices, but also, for example, aggregating the produce, buying of external inputs. If you are buying as a collective, you are better able to negotiate the prices on that side of the equilibrium as well. Income diversification activities relates to non-farm activities. So this can be very important measures in providing those safety nets against the risks that can be linked to one specific commodity. And then finally, upgrading into higher value-added production. So this is actually not always very easy to realize. And sometimes actually the costs related can be exceeding the benefits. So there is a sort of checks and balances to take into account. Just very briefly, I think the slide is also not very visible. Some of the work that Oxfam is engaged in in terms of the 12 value chains that we analyzed and where farmer incomes were strikingly low. So what we actually do currently, we engage with the supermarkets who are retailing these products produced in developing countries and then marketed and sold in supermarkets across the world. So we have 16 supermarkets, including Aldi, Tesco, Lidl, also Ahold Delhaize, for those of us living in Belgium, could be interesting. And we looked into 4 different issue areas, notably the transparency and accountability of the value chains, how supermarkets are dealing with workers' rights in the production end, how they're dealing with farmers, and how do they take gender issues into account. So these 4 issues were analyzed. This is the beginning of our campaign, so it's from last year. And on the spectrum, even though the slide is a bit small, you may notice that there is not a lot of green. And that's simply because the performance was less than 50% of what we would consider as taking into account sustainability and inclusivity issues. So just to say that if we are to rely on supporting farmers to get a better income, it's not on supermarket chains that we should be doing it. So this change has to take place elsewhere. Some entry points for change. So when we try to tackle the underlying imbalances in risk and market power, it does require quite profound changes in the rules of the game that govern agricultural production and trade. And this is relevant for value chains, for different commodity sectors, and obviously for public policy. And my recommendations, they can be valid for both ACP governments and for the EU as the main trade partner for Africa and also a main donor for ACP countries. In terms of bargaining power and living income, these are actually no-brainers in a way. So there would be a need to revisit agricultural and rural policies to enable smallholders access to productive assets, to local, national, regional markets, to training, including business training, to research, technology, and services. There is a need to invest in public goods that support smallholders so that they can increase their income. So that can be basic investments in rural roads, in electrification, in market spaces, extension services, and also enhancing the organization capacities of farmers. I wanted to highlight these 3 to begin with, because it really does mean that when we want to tackle these issues, we cannot start from individual value chains or technical fixes. We really need to look into much broader issues and the underlying problems.
Can you summarize?
Yes, just to summarize, so a word on productivity. We should not only tackle the productivity side, because yield often is not the only problem. The big part of the problem is also the insufficient incomes, and increasing yields does not support that. There may be possibilities to introduce minimum producer prices, other support mechanisms, and also promoting short food supply chains, because these often enable smallholders to obtain a better income for their production. Just very briefly on gender, so targeted measures for women. In terms of finance, still continue to focus on public finance, not only blending private sector cooperation. On food systems and territorial markets, look into the recommendations, for example, of the UN Committee on World Food Security on connecting farmers to markets. I will be happy to discuss more over the break. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Saarinen, for this interesting and brilliant presentation, especially regarding the situation of smallholders. Of course, it is known that in the multilateral negotiations with multinational companies, the case of smallholders is often mentioned. Very little money reaches them from all the money which is collected in the agricultural sector. It is due time to change, to encourage them.